Have you ever seen a single sentence rip through decades of hypocrisy, tear down the carefully painted walls of morality, and leave the so-called guardians of global trade exposed in their own contradictions? That's exactly what happened when India's foreign minister stood before the world and delivered a line so precise, so devastating, that it flipped the entire narrative on its head. When Jaishankar delivered the line, "Europe buys more oil from Russia in an afternoon than India does in a month," it wasn't just an answer to a question, it was a thunderbolt that cracked through the polished hypocrisy of international debate. Think about the weight of that sentence. In a world where Western nations endlessly preach about ethics, values, and moral responsibility in trade, here was a cold fact placed on the table like a hammer blow. The West had been pressuring India to cut down on energy imports from Russia, presenting it as a matter of morality, solidarity, and principle in the wake of the Ukraine conflict. Yet behind closed doors, European tankers were still sailing, pipelines were still pumping, and businesses were still transacting with the very nation they condemned. One line exposed all of this. One line turned the spotlight around. Instead of India being on trial, it was Europe sitting in the dock. The brilliance of this moment was in its simplicity. Jaishankar didn't launch into long explanations, didn't need to produce complex charts or statistical reports. He used their own numbers, their own behavior, and threw it back at them with surgical precision. In doing so, he stripped away the carefully built facade of moral superiority that Western leaders often project. The audience watching, whether in Europe, Asia, or America, immediately understood the essence of the message. If Europe itself was buying Russian oil in quantities dwarfing India's imports, then how could Europe lecture India? How could Europe claim the high ground? The hypocrisy stood naked for all to see. This wasn't just a defense of India's choices, it was an offensive strike. It reframed the entire conversation. Instead of India being defensive about its trade with Russia, Europe was suddenly the one answering uncomfortable questions. The power dynamic in that single exchange shifted. For years, the Western model of debate has relied on one assumption, that others will be too hesitant, too polite, or too intimidated to call out their contradictions. But here was a voice refusing to play that game. It was not emotional, not rhetorical, but grounded in undeniable truth. And that truth carried more power than any diplomatic lecture ever could. For decades, the West has thrived on building an image of itself as the guardian of morality in global affairs, dictating what is right and wrong for the rest of the world. In trade, this posture has always been the same. They present their choices as ethical, principled, and based on values, while portraying the choices of other nations as selfish, opportunistic, or even dangerous. When the Ukraine war broke out, this narrative went into overdrive. Europe and America loudly declared that buying Russian oil or trading with Moscow was a betrayal of international order. They put enormous pressure on countries like India to stop purchases, claiming it was about supporting freedom, democracy, and human rights. But the reality underneath that rhetoric told an entirely different story. European nations, desperate to keep their economies afloat and their homes heated, kept importing Russian energy. They shifted routes, disguised transactions, found loopholes, and created new channels to continue the flow. They condemned with one hand and consumed with the other. That is the illusion Jaishankar shattered with his blunt observation. The supposed moral high ground was never truly moral. It was selective. It applied only when it was convenient, only when it didn't hurt Western interests. When Europe wanted cheap gas, it was perfectly acceptable to keep the pipelines running. When America wanted cheap oil, it would release reserves and quietly trade through indirect channels. But when India, a developing nation with a population of over 1 billion, sought to secure affordable energy to protect its citizens from skyrocketing costs, suddenly it was cast as undermining the rules-based order. That double standard is exactly what Jaishankar's line exposed. It revealed that Western morality in trade is less about principles and more about power, less about values and more about control. the illusion works only if no one dares to call it out. For years, many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America went along with it, fearing backlash or sanctions if they challenged the West's narrative. But Jaishankar's statement punctured that illusion in front of a global audience. It was not simply about defending India's position, but about dismantling the very foundation of Western credibility on trade ethics. If they can bend rules for themselves while rigidly enforcing them on others, then their moral authority collapses. That collapse is what the world witnessed in that single exchange. One of the most powerful undercurrents in Jaishankar's remark about Europe's oil consumption was the contrast it drew between India's strategic autonomy and the West's strategic dependency. For decades, India has stood by the principle that no foreign power should dictate its choices in trade, security, or diplomacy. This principle isn't just rhetoric, it is rooted in India's history of colonization, when economic decisions were made in London while the consequences were borne by millions of Indians. That historical memory has made India fiercely protective of its independence in foreign policy. So when Western leaders demand that India fall in line with sanctions or abandon affordable energy sources, they are essentially asking India to give up that autonomy. Jaishankar's reply showed exactly why India cannot and will not do that. Meanwhile, the West, especially Europe, has demonstrated a clear dependency on Russia, despite its loud denunciations of Moscow. Years of reliance on cheap Russian gas left European economies vulnerable, and when the crisis hit, they found themselves scrambling for alternatives, still unable to fully break away. This dependency exposes the hollowness of their lectures to India. If Europe, with all its wealth and infrastructure, cannot withstand the shock of cutting off Russian energy, how realistic is it to expect India, still building its economy and fighting poverty, to make sacrifices at the cost of its own citizens? The hypocrisy becomes obvious when the West demands sacrifices from others that it is not willing to make itself. Strategic autonomy, in this context, is not just about pride, it is about survival. India needs the flexibility to buy from whoever gives the best terms, whether it is Russia, the Middle East, or the United States. That freedom ensures stability in a volatile world. On the other hand, strategic dependency leaves nations exposed to geopolitical shocks, as Europe has discovered. By calling out Europe's massive energy imports, Jaishankar underlined that autonomy is strength, while dependency is weakness. The West wanted to frame India's purchases as opportunism, but in truth it is Europe's vulnerability that stands exposed. The irony is striking. The very nations that present themselves as global leaders are revealed to be tied down by their own economic chains, while India demonstrates the freedom to act independently in its national interest. When Jaishankar spoke that one sharp line about Europe's oil purchases, it was not just India speaking, it was the echo of dozens of nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America who have long felt silenced in global debates. For decades, the Western world has controlled the narrative, positioning itself as the ultimate judge of right and wrong in matters of trade, politics, and morality. Countries of the global South were often told what to do, how to align, who to buy from, and who to avoid, as if their choices did not belong to them. They were treated not as equal partners but as pupils in need of constant lectures. What Jaishankar did with one sentence was to shatter that imbalance by putting Europe in the dock. He forced the world to see that the same West which speaks endlessly about rules does not hesitate to break them when its own comfort is at stake. For nations in the global South, this moment was more than rhetoric, it was representation. Many of these countries have suffered from energy shortages, debt crises, and trade restrictions imposed under the banner of Western morality. They have been accused of opportunism whenever they made decisions for their own benefit, while Western powers freely pursued self-interest without scrutiny. When India stood firm and defended its right to trade where it wished, it gave confidence to others that they too could resist the pressure. It showed that moral lectures could be answered with facts, that double standards could be exposed without fear. This was not only a defense of India's choices, but also a voice for all those nations who have waited for someone strong enough to speak on their behalf. The brilliance was that Jaishankar didn't just challenge the West with emotion, he did it with logic that could not be dismissed. By pointing out the sheer scale of Europe's own oil trade with Russia, he cut through decades of patronizing lectures and gave the global South a vocabulary of resistance. This moment reminded the world that the power to define morality does not rest only in Western capitals. It can come from New Delhi, from Nairobi, from Brasilia, or from any nation unwilling to be bullied into silence. It was a reminder that the global South is no longer an audience to lectures, it is a participant in shaping the global conversation. When Jaishankar highlighted that Europe buys more oil from Russia in a single afternoon than India does in an entire month, he ripped apart one of the most carefully guarded masks of Western diplomacy, the mask of economic morality. For years, Western governments have presented their trade decisions as principled actions rooted in values, not just profit. They frame their sanctions, restrictions, and pressure campaigns as sacrifices made in defense of global stability and democracy. But Jaishankar's statement made it impossible to ignore the truth that those same nations quietly protect their own economic lifelines while demanding others cut theirs. It exposed the raw economic hypocrisy that has too often been hidden under layers of diplomatic language. Consider the European approach to Russian energy. On stage, European leaders spoke of isolating Russia, punishing Moscow, and teaching the world that aggression comes with a cost. Yet behind the curtain, tankers carrying Russian oil still docked at European ports, pipelines still carried gas across borders, and companies still looked for loopholes that would let trade continue without attracting attention. They were not willing to freeze their industries or let their people face freezing winters, so they quietly bent the rules for themselves. But when India, with its massive population and pressing energy needs, made similar decisions openly, the response from the West was to brand it opportunism. That is the double standard Jaishankar's remark made impossible to hide. The power of that one sentence lay in its ability to reduce lofty rhetoric to undeniable arithmetic. Numbers do not lie. If Europe is consuming far more Russian energy than India ever did, then what right does it have to accuse India of undermining sanctions or betraying principles? The hypocrisy becomes glaring when the scale of European imports dwarfs India's, yet the lectures are delivered only to New Delhi. By placing this fact before the world, Jaishankar stripped away the moral pretense and left only economic self-interest visible. This moment mattered because it forced global audiences to ask uncomfortable questions. If the rules apply differently depending on who you are they really rules at all, or simply tools of control? If the West itself bends under the weight of its own needs, how can it demand rigid compliance from others? Jaishankar's sharp observation turned those contradictions into a spotlight, showing the world that economic hypocrisy, once hidden in silence, was now laid bare for everyone to see. The significance of Jaishankar's remark did not end with a clever rebuttal in a press conference. It marked a decisive turning point in how global debates are conducted. For decades, Western nations have dominated the stage, not simply because of their military or economic strength, but because of their narrative power. They were the ones who set the terms of discussion, who decided what was moral and what was immoral, who framed compliance as cooperation and independence as defiance. Most countries, fearing diplomatic backlash or economic punishment, quietly followed along. They accepted that in the theater of global politics, the West wrote the script, and everyone else played supporting roles. But in that one moment, when Jaishankar threw Europe's own numbers back at them, the script was torn apart. He reminded the world that the West does not hold a monopoly over truth or authority, and he did so without anger, without theatrics, just with facts too sharp to ignore. This shift matters because it was not a symbolic outburst. It was a demonstration of confidence. India, representing a rising power of the global south, showed that it would no longer play defense when accused of opportunism or hypocrisy. Instead, it would confront the accusers with their own contradictions. That is the essence of the turning point. The power balance in dialogue has changed. No longer is the West the unquestioned teacher, while others sit in silence. Now, leaders from outside the Western Bloc are openly challenging, questioning, and even ridiculing the inconsistencies in Western policies. And every time that happens, it weakens the old system of narrative dominance that the West relied upon for so long. The fact that this exchange gained global attention amplified its effect. Millions around the world who once felt uneasy about speaking against Western double standards saw in that moment a model of how it could be done. With composure, with precision, and with unshakable clarity, Jaishankar showed that the days of one-sided discourse were over. This was more than India defending its energy strategy. It was the emergence of a new global language in which the West no longer dictates the terms of every conversation. The turning point lies in this realization that the world is not just listening to Western narratives anymore. It is questioning them, dissecting them, and, when necessary, rejecting them outright. That shift is irreversible, and it began with a single line that cut through the noise and forced the world to confront the truth. And that is why this moment matters far beyond India, far beyond Europe, far beyond the debate on Russian oil, because it was not just about trade, it was about truth. For too long, the West has claimed the right to define morality while bending those very rules whenever it suits them. But with one line, the illusion cracked. The world saw the double standards laid bare, the hypocrisy unmasked, and the balance of narrative begin to shift. The global South found its voice, strategic autonomy stood tall, and the myth of Western moral superiority was pierced in front of a global audience. This was not simply a rebuttal, it was a declaration that nations will no longer bow to lectures wrapped in hypocrisy. It was a turning point in global discourse, and history will remember it as the moment when the truth, delivered with calm precision, finally silenced the noise of double standards.